Social Impact CX, the podcast that helps you drive mission and make a difference with customer experience.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for the Social Impact CX podcast. I'm John Corrigan, and I'll be your guide to how you can drive mission and achieve social impact with customer experience work. This is episode 22 of Social Impact CX, and again, as always, thanks for listening. Today, I'm grateful for the book Yes and, which if you've never seen the book Yes and, you should really check this one out. It came out a couple years ago. The authors of Yes and are Kelly Leonard and Tom Yorton, who both have associations with the famed Second City comedy troupe and comedy operation in Chicago. Second City has produced so many comedy luminaries of our lifetime. And in 2015, Kelly Leonard and Tom Yorton wrote this book, Yes and, that has all sorts of insights about how you can take concepts and ideas that come from the world of comedy improvisation and apply them to some new thinking then within your own organization or work culture to reverse the all negative no but. So when someone presents you with a new idea or something that you've previously never even thought of, instead of saying no, but we should do this instead, or no, but we always have done this way, forcing yourself to think about, well, yes, and then yes, and what could we be doing that might be new and different? And so until you start becoming aware about how much no but happens in your workplace, you're probably not even aware of the pervasiveness of how much no but happens on a daily basis and how much negativity there is with that. Well, this book presses into service various lessons and exercises from the world of Second City so that you and your team members can work together to get to a much more positive and creative and collaborative yes and culture, to look at things with probably a different lens and let interesting and rather unexpected ideas come from all sorts of places and all sorts of people that you might not have previously thought about. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to attend a training session at Second City in Chicago that was part of a design thinking conference I was taking part in, and it was really quite an experience. I don't know that I'll ever forget that. It's one of the most interesting business or corporate training experiences I've ever had. So I'm very pleased to say that my guest on this episode of Social Impact CX is none other than a gentleman known as Matt Arnold. Matt is a user experience expert, and we've not only had the chance to work together in our careers, but we also had the rather unique opportunity to attend that training session together at Second City in Chicago, where so many ideas that you'll find in the book Yes and are brought to life through interactive and group exercises. So I guess that I'm not only grateful for the book Yes and, but I'm certainly also grateful for the opportunity to have worked with and gotten to know Matt Arnold as well. So I occasionally get pulled into conversations about what the difference is between UX and CX, or user experience and customer experience. And that is precisely what Matt and I are talking about in these episodes. This is the beginning of our UX and CX discussion here in episode 22. There will be more to follow. So let's get to it with my conversation with none other than Matt Arnold, talking about user experience and customer experience. And we certainly take this conversation into the ideas of what that means in a social impact or nonprofit environment. I'm very pleased to welcome to the Social Impact CX podcast, Matt Arnold. In this conversation, we're going to explore a subject that I always find interesting, UX and CX. That's user experience and customer experience. How do UX and CX relate? Where do these two disciplines overlap? Where do they complement each other? How are they different? Why it's important to understand similarities and differences? I think this is an interesting conversation. So, full disclosure, as we get started here, Matt and I have had the opportunity to work together a few years ago when we were both at ACT, this is a major nonprofit organization in the education sector. Presently, Matt is UX director for both Handrail and Connect 5, and I'll let him explain a bit more about that. When we worked together at ACT, however, I have to say Matt was a true leader on the customer experience team, and he was responsible for various different programs, including putting together ACT's first user experience initiative, and I think that was quite a learning experience. It was interesting to watch him create that team. We've had the chance to train on UX together, and we've also both explored some other related areas in training, such as design thinking and service design, and some other interesting innovation concepts. I've had the true pleasure of Matt and I both attended a training session at Second City in Chicago. If any of you have ever read the book Yes and, if you haven't read Yes and, I recommend it highly. But we hopefully we don't fall into too familiar terminology. If Matt says red ball somewhere in the middle of our conversation, that's where that is. But we'll try and keep it under control here. So did I get all that information correct, Matt?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Red Ball.
There you go. All right, we're off to a good start. With that, actually, I'm going to turn over to Matt so he can tell us a little bit about his background and how he came into a career in user experience or UX.
Yeah, so I think probably where to start is just going back to a little bit of my education was really focused on, I was a communication major, but I was doing a lot of early technology projects, early internet and web projects, and just really interested in how do people use technology, what are they trying to accomplish. Went to grad school and focused on computer augmented decision making, how do people use technology to make better decisions.
So you went from communications to computer augmented decision making.
Right, and actually the program I was in was a master's in communication studies program at Illinois State, but my research was a joint initiative between the computer science department and the communication department. So it was that they were really looking at the intersection of technology and human need.
Yeah, and that gets us right to user experience.
Right.
Interesting, yeah. Okay.
And after that, ended up in Minneapolis, worked in the tech community and design community in the Twin Cities, and early days of the web, before there were web standards, and really started getting into observing customers, using our technology, talking to customers, not knowing that there was a practice called UX at the time, but really just continue to investigate what are ways that we can make better decisions by understanding what our customers are trying to accomplish. Sure. And that kind of led to a career in what we now call UX or design.
Yeah, interesting. So how before we get too far down the path into UX, talk about UX and design, because I know those are two concepts that are very related for you, and they should be related for a lot of people, but tell us a little bit about how you see them as interrelated.
Yeah, and I think some folks might be maybe more righteous about their definitions of UX,
right.
And for me, I think focusing more on user-centered design, so both from the design or design thinking framework to on the UX side, how do you make things useful and usable for folks?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think on the UX side you might be thinking more about, it might be more interfaces and how do they really come into contact. But I like to think of it more, and this might be as we dig in closer to a CX side, like what's the overall brand or service,
right.
And what are the interactions that people are having? What creates value for them? How do you help enable that?
Right.
And how do you do it in a way that grounds your brand identity?
Right.
So like you might say that you have a particular brand promise, but if you can't ground it in their reality, it's difficult. So sometimes I talk to Avis, right? Their most successful time is when they position themselves as trying harder.
Right.
So it was going to be service oriented. So if you go to an Avis counter and people look like they're working to help you, that feels right. But if you go to an Avis counter and somebody's sleeping, it doesn't feel like they're grounded in reality. And so a lot of what I like to do is integrate brand strategy, and then how does that come to life? And so on the UX side, that might be more and more it's digital interfaces, but it still could be what's a physical interface,
right.
Even the way paper is presented to somebody.
Right.
And that's where you start to bleed into maybe it's more customer experience, right? All these touch
Sure.
points. So, yeah, kind of the UX side was really trying to bring in how do we basically keep our brand promise from a service side in understanding what's important for the customer and then focusing those in the constraints of the business.
I think that's so important to bring out, that that even though you're in a specific discipline, you still understand the broader context of brand promise and that. And while I have tremendous respect for and appreciation for people who delve deep into one of these areas of practice or discipline, such as even usability or user interface, or the training that goes along with creating that in-person experience, or the culture aspect in that. No matter how deep you go in a specialty in this field, I think it's really important to make sure that you always have that broader context of what we're all trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And then you put the customer in the center. And here at SocialImpactCX, sometimes we don't always use the word customer.
Yeah.
We're dealing with organizations that are working to serve beneficiaries or patients or members.
Yeah.
But the concepts apply. And we always talk about that too, is that these concepts translate. You're trying to create more value for somebody.
Yes.
Treat somebody better.
Yeah, and you're hitting on an area, and I still don't know how to best articulate it myself, but I've been trying to use human-centered design a lot more, because I feel like sometimes we do kind of talk past each other when you're talking about a variety of stakeholders. And so I'm with you that there's sometimes they have many labels, but we're trying to think about the person that is using or needing benefit from this.
Right.
And sometimes especially in some nonprofits and social, it's a very complex ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because the user beneficiary might not be the person making the purchase decision.
You don't have the clarity of the sale of revenue necessarily. Yeah. So although I'm a huge fan of the term user or human-centered design, HCD. What I think is unfortunate is that when you get into people who are running organizations or a nonprofit, if you bring up HCD or human-centered design, sometimes you get this very quizzical look or eyes glass over a little bit. It's really the idea of putting the customer in the center and then making your decisions, not just even design decisions.
Right.
I mean, this should impact budgets and people and who's doing what and what you're going to do next year, because you could do something better than what's happening this year.
Yeah.
It's planning. I mean, it really has this broader impact on organizations, and it's fascinating to connect with people who have gotten into human-centered design. I hope that we find more of that as we go down the path.
And just to make it more interesting and complicated, is that also design can be a problematic term.
Oh, yes.
So I think a lot of times people might think of it as just how it looks. Like we can design that later, rather than design being how the whole thing works, how this whole system comes together.
I know that in my career, I have had at least one experience where we got fascinating effort underway with customer experience and user experience, and I was asked by a CEO, so what's next? And I said design, and the rest of the room just kind of looked at me. And I had one other person in the room who's like, yes, that makes sense. And I meant design in the context of how do we think about what we're doing and how do we shape that experience around whoever we're trying to serve or sell to or service or whatever. But I think the word design was then a real disconnect for others. It's whether you lead human resources or you're a CIO or you're a sales executive or whatever, the word design can sound very foreign sometimes, but yet it really has this holistic meaning that can connect across the whole organization or enterprise, but that it gets lost sometimes with that word.
I agree. I think and I think sometimes even trying to talk about design quickly, I try to focus on helping clients when I do consulting think about goal-based design. So sometimes we talk about that, and then just quickly trying to describe that as a person trying to accomplish something in a particular context, right? So then we start thinking about, okay, who are the actors in the ecosystem? What is happening to them? What's the emotional state that they might be in when they're trying to access a product or service, and what is it that they need to accomplish? And then for us, also needing to tie it back to business value. So what we try to do is we'll talk about at Connect 5 and Handrail, we'll talk about needing to make products or services. We're doing research so that we can design meaningful experiences for the end user or stakeholder that are effective for business.
Right.
And another way that I've tried to help frame it quickly, because sometimes design doesn't sound very businesslike.
Yes.
Is really design is how we create and capture value.
Right.
Right. So how is this system going to be valuable? And value can be dollars. It can be emotional return. Right. So we don't talk about profit.
Right.
Talk about value. How do you create value? And then how do you capture it?
Right.
So and then that's kind of both sides of the human side, consumer, stakeholder, beneficiary, and then also the organization.
Right.
So,
two things you touched on. I love the word ecosystem. Ecosystem, I think, sometimes helps translate the concept of design into something more understandable, because I think ecosystem is a word used a lot in business now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great thing for, if you're talking about design, talking about the ecosystem. But then also, I'm going to ask you about how you measure results, how you measure a return on your investment, because this is a matter of time and money to do this work, which is really important to do. But how do you measure results? And I think the emotional result is something that doesn't get measured enough, and that's an important one to think about too.
It is important and challenging.
Very challenging. Very challenging. Yes.
Yeah, and I think for me throughout my career over 20 years now, those were even some of the early questions about brand and brand equity.
Sure.
And I think on the marketing and brand strategy side, there was progress that was made, right? Just positive feelings that people have with a brand or a go-to kind of decision making. But I think when we're talking more about investment in design, and sometimes it might be measured in return.
Right.
And have we invested in this, and are we seeing better results?
Right.
So sometimes those could be just more markers when we started doing this, like before or after. Right. Did we start seeing different returns? I think some other things with measuring is it might be related. Sometimes we talk about ROI, right?
Yeah.
I mean, then when it's pure dollars and cents, you're looking at return on investment. But with good design, when they have fewer questions about how to use your products or services, there's fewer support calls. And those are other things that you can measure. Is were they able to finish a transaction? Were they able to complete this without support problems?
Yep.
So those are some.
I've got a question for you that's coming up here. So let's come back to that. I have a scenario that I think will help frame our conversation, although we don't seem to have a problem getting our conversation going here. But before I start, is there anything that you want to talk about in regards to Handrail and Connect 5?
Thanks. So at Connect 5, that is, we consider ourselves a user research and design agency, where we'll help with understanding a problem or opportunity space. Think about concepts to help bring designs to life, check desirability with a market, and then make more refined design decisions, doing detailed design and measuring. And Sean McKay, the founder, Connect 5 represented 5 pillars of discipline that needed to come together. So also his founding of the company was very much an ecosystem view on some of the things that we needed to do to bring in strategy, research, design, and one of the pillars is measurement. So what type of metrics so that it makes sense. And Sean said at times, sometimes he thought when he started Connect 5, one of the things he was doing was basically translating all the different business disciplines into user need and translating it back to what does that mean for your different disciplines inside the company, and then also helping different parts of an organization talk to each other.
Interesting.
Okay. So that's silos. A lot of helping with the breaking
across silos.
And that's one thing I felt throughout my career is using the kind of the customer when you put them at the center, rather than arguing or debating with each other on opinion. It's what makes sense for them.
Right.
But Connect 5, just getting back to that, basically kind of a full stack research and design agency. So a lot to unpack, but we kind of talk through all of the different elements of kind of user research and design. And then Handrail is a product created by Connect 5. So that's our entry into product space, moving from service to product. But it came out of our own need to keep our research organized. And so we're really delivering on insights workflow for research teams that are trying to bring insights and decision making into product success.
Okay. And for our listeners, I'll post online in conjunction with this podcast episode a link to both Connect 5 and Handrails. So people can
Great.
check it out.
Great, thanks.
All right. Okay, so I was having this conversation the other day with somebody, and I knew that our conversation was coming up, and I immediately thought of you, and I told this person, that's the next podcast episode. So, let me paint a picture here, and then I'm very interested in your response. So I was talking with someone who's fairly new. They're doing some design thinking training, which maybe we can talk a little bit about design thinking when we get through this. And he's interested in this overall subject area, and he said that a colleague of his who's in this design thinking training with him recently told him something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, that UX and CX are pretty much the same thing, and that they've both been around for a long time. They're always just called something else, and I told him that I thought that some elements of both UX and CX, especially in very customer-oriented organizations, you talk about the classic examples of CX and UX. You talk about Disney and others who have always put the customer at the center. Of course, some of the things that are part of UX and CX are you can find in those. But I talked with him a bit about the practice of that. I think UX is many times found where, these days at least, where there's some form of computer or technology device involved, some sort of interface. Although UX is not necessarily exclusive to technology.
Right.
That's a lot of UX work and the focus, that especially with, I think, user interface, and we can talk about interaction design and usability and all those things. And then what I tried to explain that I think customer experience is a slightly broader subject that should absolutely include the discipline of user experience and all the benefits and insights you get from good UX work, but that you then begin to go into kind of a broader cross-section of work to have a customer experience effort. And so you start getting into then journey mapping and voice of customer programs. And then both of these disciplines have to do with brand, but how you're impacting brand might take a slight different lens from a CX perspective than a more traditional UX perspective. You get into customer service issues, which actually UX is really important to customer service also. But so I tried to take him down that, and I realized I was talking too much, and he goes, "Thank you for sharing all that information." And I realized that I should pull back a little bit. But I'm very interested in your take. If you were talking to someone who is new to this area of work, how would you describe UX versus CX? How are they different? Where are some of the key points of overlap and interactivity or dependency, if you will?
Yeah.
How would have you answered that question?
Well, because I've been in organizations confronted with like people looking for definitions. I think,
right.
and sometimes personally, it's when I feel like maybe rushed or stressed. Maybe I'm don't want to get into this argument right now. But then other time when I think people are earnestly trying to understand. So what are the things that would be helpful? And so some of the things then when thinking about it is, I think where they do have common space is that customer-centric or human-centric approach is how do we put the customer at the center, which probably could be a whole side topic, is the fear of turning over things to there's an internal fear like, we'll be out of control, we'll lose control if we do this.
That's a big transition for any organization that it decides to turn that corner.
So what we're trying to, again, what is meaningful, what are they trying to accomplish? But when I look at CX, sometimes I look at that as sharing a lot of space with brand. It is more of an umbrella. It's what it can be lots of touch points. UX sometimes being more specific about an interface, and as you said, more digital, and we can see why UX is really been growing quickly over the past 15 years, and still looking to continue to move. But I look at that as what they share in common is that kind of design approach, but where I see also kind of, you could sometimes substitute service design, CX, design thinking, even UX, but I tend to see UX as a subset of CX. If I had to like kind of force the relationship, but sometimes I feel like UX, especially the way that jobs are, promoted or recruited, you're usually looking for people to enhance interfaces, right, and enhance interactions. But what's becoming interesting is as UX is growing and we have more technology where there is an interface where you're touching something, we're getting into the world of headless displays. Yep. We're getting voice operators. So even just when we've really figured out how a good website should operate or a computer program should operate, now we have all these new interfaces where we kind of have to rethink. And is that a CX space? Is it a UX space?
Right.
That can be kind of a gray area.
So what I think is interesting, though, is that even as it's hard to believe that your computer screen or your phone screen is going to become an outmoded interface, but it is already and will be, and it will become one of the interfaces instead of the interface. And actually, all these new interfaces that are headless or voice-based or whatever, they're all designed about how do you reduce friction to get somebody to what they're wanting to get to.
Right.
Just like the web browser, how people reduce the friction having to go to the library or call somebody for their research report or so they can send it over via paper. It's really I was at VoiceCon, which is one of the Gary V's. I'm somewhat sucked into the world of VaynerMedia, not completely converted yet, but the whole discussion was about how do you reduce friction, because that is such a concept when it comes to disruption. But at the end of the day, if you understand, this is why it's so important, if you understand human-centered design, user-centered design, the concepts of service design and design thinking, which could be a whole other conversation that we could have.
Right.
The principles of understanding empathy and understanding process and how somebody engages with whatever it is you're trying to do. I would be fascinated to know who came up with Hey Alexa. I mean that's actually, it's an experience that you have. It's a beginning of an experience that then may be better or worse depending upon whatever it is that you're doing. But understanding the experience from the perspective of whoever it is you're trying to get to or to help or whatever.
Right.
That's what it's all, and that's the common thread. And there's different angles to all these different things, whether it's user experience or customer experience or service design or whatever. But it's all about how do you understand how this is going to work for whomever's consuming this, using it, they're the ones having the experience. So.
Yeah, and I think one where they might differ as well, at least what I've seen in organizations too, is sometimes CX tends to be, in the large organizations, also having more quantitative numbers. Here's where we're seeing volume, here's where we're seeing maybe health or satisfaction.
Right, and those quantitative numbers indicate goodness or badness usually.
Yeah, and describes a what.
Yes.
And then a lot of the research in UX, or some of the things we'll look at in UX, might be more on the qualitative side.
Right.
The why, really getting into some of the context, and also some of the designs. Big discipline within UX is information architecture, kind of one of the original parts of UX, which is really how are we organizing information, what labels are we using, and sometimes understanding the mental models of who might be using this. Like, does this label have meaning?
Right.
Convey the right meaning?
Right.
Is it helpful?
Right.
So still some differences too.
Right. One of the things that we're talking here that I think is really important to point out, and for listeners of Social Impact CX, this is a recurring theme. It doesn't, I don't think it really matters whether you're doing user experience work or customer experience work, or maybe even some of both as a team. Collaboration at the end of the day is so critical to whether or not you're going to be successful in the work that you're doing. Because even though you or your team might be tasked with figuring out what this user interface means or does not mean, or this experience being good or bad, at the end of the day, it's the rest of the it's a whole team of people that are producing that. What contributes to the interface, why the interface is there, or how that experience happens. And so what is never successful is doing this work UX or CX in a vacuum. You're, by definition, you are being tasked as a collaborator. In order to be successful, you will have to collaborate. I think that's a common thread through UX and CX work.
Absolutely. We actually say that it design's a team sport.
That's it.
Because you're really trying to, it's hard to be successful as a solo practitioner. All the people that you need to do good design, all the people you need to collaborate with to make this effective and a reality for your customers and to realize that business value, it's absolutely a team sport.
This has been Social Impact CX Podcast Episode 22, and that was the first part of my great conversation with user experience expert Matt Arnold. And I hope that some of you check out that book that I mentioned in the intro, Yes And, from Kelly Leonard and Tom Yorton. Matt and I have been referencing that book for a few years now. It's really fantastic. As I've said before, Social Impact CX is also intended to be an interactive forum, a place to stir conversation, answer questions, provide some context, hopefully achieve a better understanding of customer experience and user experience work, because they're so important. It's so important how they work together. So what questions do you have after listening to my discussion with Matt? Questions about user experience or anything else that came to mind as we were talking? You can ask a question or make a comment at Social Impact CX a couple different ways. First, you can send an email to comment@socialimpactcx.com. That's COMMENT at SocialImpactCX.com. You can also find us on Twitter and post a question there. Our Twitter handle is SocialImpactCX. And please follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with new podcasts and other related content. You can also find me on Twitter. My handle is John F. Corrigan. Or if you're listening to this podcast via YouTube, feel free to post a question in the comments section. That goes for SoundCloud as well. And we'll do our best to catch you there. And if you're on YouTube or SoundCloud listening, please subscribe so that we can track with you and keep you up to date on future episodes. This is John Corrigan reminding you that, especially in social impact work, it's important to understand that your mission is really all about someone else's journey. And the more you know about someone's journey, the more you can help. Thanks for listening to Social Impact CX.